now. Phillip Thompson, welcome to Suit Up the Podcast.
Well, thank you. It's nice to be here. Thanks for asking me.
I think it's so awesome when I get to see the background because so people are listening to this right now and potentially watching on YouTube, but you have a great book setup around you. In addition to you have an awesome mug. Like if I'm completely fair, I think that it's having the ability to see the mug that the guest drinks from for their coffee that makes doing the Zoom call the best part.
I would agree with that.
So, introducing yourself to the audience, would you mind just giving us a brief biographical sketch? Who
Sure.
is Phillip?
Well, I grew up in East Mississippi, and went to college, and then joined the Marine Corps. Spent 12 years on active duty, and then since then, I've spent most of my time living in Virginia, mostly as a journalist and some sort of writer communications. But I've been doing that for quite a few years, and started, writing for real probably 15 or 20 years ago. Um, Went through a series of, what am I going to write? How am I going to sound? And then settled on, my central character in 4 novels, Colt Harper. And then, just kept writing.
Hey, that's really the key is to keep writing because the thing is, most people, when I talk to people who want to be writers or talk about writing, they usually don't get out of that first couple of writing project stages where they're finding that voice and what to write, etc. I don't think people appreciate how very few writers are Hemingway and Fitzgerald, where, the first novel is like this, the identity born. It's
Right.
usually those first few things. And even if you look at, say, Hemingway or Fitzgerald, they had countless short stories that were absolute garbage that they
Hmm.
went through to get to the point where their voice and their identity as a writer was made.
Yeah, I have run across the same thing, whether it's somebody who's a new writer or somebody who says, "Hey, I want to write a book." Okay, and they've got this great idea, and they'll spend 15 minutes telling you the great idea, and then you kind of have to say, "Well, okay, have you written it yet?" Well, no.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, write it. You know,
Mm-hmm.
you have to sit down and put in the discipline of doing it, and yeah, it's a process. You don't. I don't think anybody, well, very few people walk around with a whole idea in their head. It can go from start to finish and do it. It's just a process. Putting that time in when you don't want to write, you
Mm-hmm.
know, those days when the last thing you want to do is sit down and spend the next 2 hours trying to crank out 10 pages. But that's part of that. I mean, that's important to the process too.
Mm-hmm. I think that Stephen King had a quote that's like, you show up whether the muse shows up or not. And if you get there, you start doing it. Eventually, the muse shows up, chomping a cigar and all.
Yeah, and that's more often than not, that's been the case with me. A long time ago, I had a different lifestyle that enabled me to do this. But every night around 8 or 9 o'clock, I would sit down in front of my computer, big desktop back then,
Mm-hmm.
big gateway computer, and I would spend 1 hour sitting in front of the computer,
Mm-hmm.
whether I wrote anything or not. And some nights I would sit there for an hour and maybe write a paragraph. And then some nights I would sit there for an hour and look up, and it's been 3 hours and I've written, 4 chapters.
Yeah.
It just comes and goes. But I made sure that, okay, I'm going to do this every night for an hour and just put myself in the space where if something creative happens, I'm there to capture it.
Mm-hmm. It really is a matter of showing up. I love
Hmm.
it comparing writing to athletics because a lot of it is countless hours of training. You
That is
are
true.
always the book is not written until the final page is finished, until the final word, but you can't get there without all those subsequent things that you do to lead up to that moment.
Right.
And there's a comment you made that I wanted to circle back on a little bit, which is people will tell you like their idea and it takes like 15 minutes. The more that I write and the more that I read, the more I've discovered it doesn't need to be a complex plot.
Hmm.
Good stories are actually usually the plot is razor thin, but the characters are well drawn out and they're the propellers of the story. Now, obviously, there's some differences. There's some stories that are high concept that are the plot is all of it, but they seem
Right.
to be more rare And that's why I love about the genre that you write in, which is this noir genre. And the hard-boiled one really lends itself well to strong protagonist put into a situation that doesn't have to be highly complex to have a good story and a good adventure.
You know, you said that better than I could. That's exactly what I try to do. And yeah, there's that constant argument among writers, you know, plot versus character,
Hmm.
or and I think we talked about it in the Starlight podcast. You
Yeah,
know,
we
do you
did.
write an outline? Do you just seat of your pants? And I was taught, you know, by a very, very good writing instructor who was a great author. He sadly he's passed, a guy named Robert Bausch,
Hmm.
and he everything was about character, and it started with a character. And he taught me that, yeah, sometimes you take a character, and I mean, you know how it is when characters start talking in your heads, and they won't shut
Yes.
up. Okay,
When they
let's
become their
drop.
own people.
They do become their own people. Let's drop him in a situation, see what happens to him. And you may not know. And a lot of times that happens. You know, I'll sit down and start writing. I have no idea where the next hour is going to go. I have to let the character do it. And now,
Hmm.
granted, there's a structure of a plot. You know, I
Yes.
know that he's going to be here, and this is the conflict that is presented
Hmm.
to this character.
Yes.
What does he do? And
Hmm.
from there, I try to, you know, get in that character's head, and or he gets in mine, whichever, and just let it go from there.
Hmm. So you just came out, you released in September, I think it was, Not Dead Enough, which also I have to say is a great title. It
Thank you.
I don't know if Bond flavors were what you were going for. Maybe it's just that my like entire world of perception is to see James Bond things, poster behind me.
Yeah.
But the Not Dead Enough is such a great title. I also think that the cover for this one was the best so far. The
Ah,
thing that
thank
threw
you.
me off was that on Amazon's list is the third Colt Harper book,
Right.
when in actuality it is the fourth.
It is the fourth. The very first one was published by another publisher.
Okay.
The last three have been published by Brash Books. And so when Brash packages them, they tend to, you know, these are
Hmm.
ours, and
Yeah.
what came before. And as it turns out, in the, you know, over the years that I've been writing these, the first one, which was called Deep Blood, and it was
Hmm.
again published by another publisher, sort of serves as a prequel to
Mm.
the whole story.
Hmm. Well, and something else I want to give you huge kudos on is that Not Dead Enough. So it's the fourth book in the series. I haven't read the
Hmm.
previous ones yet. I'm looking forward to reading them. But they have, if you can drop into a series at a midpoint
Hmm.
and not have to feel like you're missing all this information, that's perfect, because the point to serialized storytelling with a character that is continuing to go on is that you should be able to pick up any of their adventures and enjoy them, and it's just enough to make you want to read the others. So
Right.
that was something that I definitely experienced with Not Dead Enough, is that immediately everyone there is fully formed. These are characters and stories, elements you can tell that they have past and future that you want to know more about, but it doesn't detract from you enjoying where they are now and the adventure they're on now.
Well, thank you for that. That's kind of you to say. And I, yeah, I think that sometimes, you know, if you read books that are intentionally written to be in order, it's very confusing. It's a little frustrating as a reader.
Yeah.
And you know, I remember a thousand years ago when I started reading the Travis McGee series. You know, John
Hmm.
MacDonald is probably the whole reason I decided to write a series of books in the first place. Well,
Really?
it's not probably, yeah. Um, I stumbled across a Travis McGee novel, you know, many years ago, and I have no idea which one it was in the series. There's 21 Travis novels,
Hmm.
and most of them are right behind me.
Oh, that's so
Um,
cool.
but I picked up one and read it, and I thought this is so cool, and I knew immediately that there's got to be something that came before.
Hmm.
Um, and so then when I started doing the research and found out, oh, there's a whole bunch of these, then I went back and started the long process of trying to get all of them and then organize them in order and read them,
Hmm.
you know, 1 through 21, which I did. And it was a great complete story. But then I realized, even though you read them in order, you don't have to. And that
Yeah.
there was something that kind of stuck with me. And the Bond novels, if you ask
Hmm.
me, are kind of the same way. I started reading the Bond novels about the same time, and the more I read them, the more I realized, okay, first of all, they don't they don't adapt a book when they make a movie.
Oh
There's
no.
there's scenes pulled from all over the place for the movies. But it was interesting that from the very first time you pick up a Bond novel, you know who James Bond is. He's fully formed, like you said. There's obviously a backstory, and then as you go, you pick up the breadcrumbs until, in your own mind, you have a full picture of the person.
I did warn you that I'd ask about your favorite Bond novel and also your favorite Bond film. So I'm really
Yes,
curious if the titles will be the same or not. But what is your favorite Bond novel and favorite Bond film?
I think the favorite novel was Live and Let Die.
Ooh, mm-hmm.
There was, I don't know, there's something about it, and again, I read it a long time ago, but I do remember it stuck with me. There was just a flavor to that one that I really, really enjoyed.
It's as
Favorite
a book,
movie?
it's fascinating because that one, it's an outlier because it has the whole plot for those who don't know and only think of the film. So the film, it's like a drug plot. In the book,
Hmm.
it's all about buried treasure,
Right,
pirate gold, which is so
right.
weird. We don't think of James Bond and go, oh, obviously he's going to go after pirate gold.
Yeah, and it was an outlier, and it was different, and I think that's what. Oh, you
Mhm.
read I had read several before that one. It's like, well, this is different. I kind of like this, and it really just grabbed my attention. My favorite movie is a different title. My favorite
Mhm.
movie is Skyfall.
Yes. Skyfall is gorgeous. Like
It
it's
is.
I honestly think that it's one of the most beautifully shot of the Bond films.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember if it's Roger Deakins, I'd like to say was the cinematographer for that film or
I'm
director of
I'm going to defer
photography.
to you on that.
But he's known for just being beautifully shot, and really, that's I think one of the hardest things to go from that Skyfall to Spectre is they didn't
Yeah.
have him on Spectre, and everything they literally threw like the sepia tone on it, and it just kind of looks a little.
Right.
But no, Skyfall is gorgeous as a film. What's your go-to on it?
Uh, I did love. I mean, Bond movies are known for the opening scene, and that one
Mhm.
was like you said, it was gorgeous. It was this beautifully sequenced and shot thing that was happening. The go-to for me is when he reveals the Aston Martin,
Mhm.
and there were just so many little Easter eggs along the way. And the story, maybe it resonates with me because I'm not in my 20s anymore,
Mhm.
but here's Bond clearly toward the end of his career, and we're not really sure what to do with this guy.
Mhm.
And there's, I think, the relationship between Bond and M is the best it's ever been, and you
Mhm.
really see that you know, you can call it a love-hate relationship, but I think there's more love than hate there.
Mhm.
Um, and and they just take you through this story of a man trying to, in this modern world, so to speak, this man trying to grapple with his own identity. I just
Mhm.
thought it was beautifully done, and I love the fact that Judi Dench is M. I love her to
Yes.
death. Um, uh, Wishaw as Q is one of the best moments of casting I've ever seen, and I look forward to seeing him some more.
In my favorite scene in Spectre, the follow-up with Wishaw, is that when he goes, but I have cats. He's like describing how he needs to like keep his job, and Bond's like, well, do it for the cats.
That was funny, yeah.
Uh, it really does help with having a good ensemble cast. And I think that that's something the Bond films in particular have done really well at. So much
Right.
so that you've seen it bleed over into the books and the adaptations sometimes, where in the post Fleming books, you see more of Moneypenny or Tanner or these other characters from the stories. One of the things I think you do a really great job surrounding Colt Harper with is he has a really great ensemble of characters around him. Molly and Not Dead Enough, I think, was such a standout character and delightful anytime she was on the page.
Yeah, people like Molly, which is I'm always surprised when I hear that. It for me, it's sometimes difficult to write for a female
Hmm.
character.
Hmm.
but I don't know, maybe because she's a redhead. I mean, Molly just kind of, she kind of starts, gnawing in your ear a little bit, and it's kind of funny. I kind of, I do enjoy writing scenes for her, but yeah, more than one person has said, what the hell with Molly?
With the whole Colt Harper series, what I love is it really has, and again, I've only read the first book, the
Mhm.
Not Dead Enough so far. Looking forward to reading the others because it does have this unique space where it's written in a wonderful hard-boiled noir style, but the town makes me think of Mayberry. Like the setting,
Really?
and maybe it's just because I grew up on the Andy Griffith Show, so the moment I hear like Southern Sheriff, my
Right.
brain goes, "Oh, I'm thinking of Andy Griffith." But I think that that's a testament to not only just that character stuck around enough in my head, but
Hmm.
that so describe the world of Colt Harper because we're starting to talk about the book and people may not know about Not Dead Enough and the story itself.
Okay. Yeah, Colt is the sheriff of a small rural East Mississippi. It's a fictionalized town. It's my hometown, but it's a very fictionalized version. I realized when I first started writing it that it's it just feels better for me
Hmm.
if I write about that particular hometown with some of the recollections that I have from a long
Hmm.
time ago. So it's
It's a
not
place you can
today's.
see and visualize in your head.
Mhm. It's not today's version necessarily.
Hmm.
A lot of the places that I mentioned don't look like that anymore, or they aren't there. But Colt inhabits this world that he grew up in. Clearly, he was in the Marine Corps for a while. He comes back home and he's settled in now, and he has just a very few people around him that he works with and trusts or don't trust. And then knowing in the previous books, especially knowing so many of the people around the small place brings its own conflict.
Hmm.
He had a very, very difficult relationship with his father. His mother's never in the picture because she lives somewhere else.
Hmm.
He's got some very close friends. John is his best friend for life. There's a woman also in the town. She doesn't make an appearance in this book, but she's a very, very close friend from when he was a teenager. So he lives in this sort of insular world
Hmm.
that he once left and then came back to. So he brings that
Mm,
sort of,
yeah.
worldview sensibility to it, or cynicism in some cases. And he has his own thoughts about what justice is, and sometimes it's hard to tell. Is he after justice or is he after revenge? I don't think he can answer that question because that line is so blurry.
Hmm.
And then when you get into this particular book, this is really a story about two combat veterans
Yeah.
and the bond that people who serve in the military form with each other, especially if they've been in combat.
Hmm.
And then, and as is true in life, you form these really, really intense bonds with people in really intense situations. But then, after it's over and everybody comes back home and people leave the service and then they go on to their own lives and the friendship is there, but it's dormant. And then
Hmm.
years later, you find yourself face to face with that person again, and everything has changed. Colt is a lawman, and Flip is somebody completely different. He's a struggling addict who does something really, really stupid,
Hmm.
and he comes to the only person that he can remember that could possibly help him. And John sort of acts, John Carver, his deputy, acts as sort of the mediator between these two people who
Yeah.
are on the extremes. Colt's on one extreme and Flip is
Hmm.
on the other. Um, and I just I wanted to write the book for a few years. The story started probably a dozen years ago. I wrote a short story for at the time what was a new nonprofit called the Veterans Writing Project,
Oh.
and it
Hmm.
was a nonprofit started up in D.C. to provide a platform for military veterans to express themselves creatively, whether it
Hmm.
was through writing or singing or
Oh,
painting,
cool.
even stand-up comedy. It's a fantastic
Oh,
organization.
that's awesome.
Yeah, it was really good. So I don't remember the exact moment that I said I'm going to write this story, but I just started writing it, and it's this wild story about two Marines in Desert Storm. One's called Moon Pie Jones, and the other one is Flip Wilson. Flip Wilson, incidentally, is a white person who's nicknamed Flip Wilson. Moon Pie thinks that's hysterical. Nobody else does, especially Flip himself. But in that story, they
Mhm.
they get into trouble, and Moon Pie ends up getting killed. And when I finished that story and submitted it, and I was very grateful that they decided to publish it, and it was in the very first issue of their literary magazine. And I put the story down and thought that's great. And again, how characters can get
Mhm.
inside your head. I kept wondering years later, whatever happened to Flip? This tragic thing happens to him. He comes back
Mhm.
home, he gets out of the Marine Corps, and then what? He just wanders off into Southern California.
Mhm.
And it was always in my subconscious. And then, a couple of years after that story, I created Colt Harper. And then, he was a completely different guy in a completely different part of the world. And, as he comes together, it's like, okay, well, he's a veteran too. Does he know Flip?
Mhm.
Maybe he does. Well, if he knows Flip, does he have a secret too? Well, maybe he does. And then, after I wrote the Outside the Law, which was, the second book in the series, when I sat down to start writing that, I really wanted to write the Flip story, but I just wasn't quite ready to do that.
Yeah.
So I put it aside again, and then finally it sort of coalesced in my mind, and I said, okay, this is what I want to do. What happens when Cole, who's completely forgotten about this guy, and the last time they talked, he was very involved in his own addiction,
Mhm.
and Cole basically says, this guy, he's a hopeless case. He shows up, and I need your help,
Mhm.
and Colt now has to determine, how much can I help him, and how does that balance up against my sworn duty to uphold the law,
Mhm.
and therein becomes the tale.
Which that is where stories are at their best, is when you take a character and you force them against their limits. I
Mm-hmm.
think it was there's a great YouTube creator called Beyond the Screenplay. They did a video on the perfect antagonist, and they
Ah,
contrasted. They used the Dark Knight as the example, where the Joker is the perfect antagonist to the Dark Knight because he is pushing Batman literally to the extent of everything. I think that a story itself should, in some way, be the antagonist to the protagonist. The story itself should be driving the protagonist to force them to draw their lines. What are they willing to do and not do? One other thing I thought of from what you were describing is that so the hero's journey is the idea of obviously that we know the familiar story beats from Star Wars, except for one. At the end of the hero's journey, the hero is supposed to
mm-hmm.
return back home with whatever that treasure is. And then the next thing is them having to integrate back into society. And what's interesting is what you've described for Colt Harper is essentially he's kind of been on that hero's journey and is now back home and having to part of the struggle is integrating back into the world that he was once in with the knowledge he now has.
Yes, I think that is a fair assessment, and it's sort of been the struggle for him all along. And I know that I didn't. I don't think I did this consciously or anything, but
Mm-hmm.
if left to his own devices, that book would have been 3 pages long.
Mm-hmm.
Colt would have, well, he would have slapped the cuffs onto Flip, and it would have been over. It, you know, he's he inhabits a very black and white world,
Mm-hmm.
um, and I have to watch out for that, as a narrator or as a writer rather. But
Mm-hmm.
because I do not inhabit a black and white world, but this guy does. Um, and if it weren't, that's where I use John, because if it weren't for
Mm-hmm.
John, his best friend, and John knows both Colt and he knows Flip,
Mm-hmm.
and he is sometimes he's part of Flip. He's on Flip's side and he's pushing Colt and pushing him, pushing him, pushing,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes he's like, okay, well, I see your point, Colt. We have to do this because, you know, we're lawmen. Um, and it's really interesting. Yeah, I love what you said about pushing the protagonist. You know, and if it comes out that way, that's wonderful. I'm glad that it did, because the whole time, you know, part of the struggle of writing the book was,
Mhm.
okay, like I said, I could end this right now. You know,
Yes.
Colt punches him in the mouth and puts the cuffs on him and hauls him off. And he
Hmm.
does that a lot, you know, in the previous
Hmm.
books. That's what he's known for. He's fast with that pistol and he never misses. And he doesn't argue a lot. You know, he
He really has a
tends to,
great Old West lawman sensibility in the story, which I, as
yeah.
someone who grew up watching Bonanza, Gunsmoke, just I love John Wayne films. So when like Rio Bravo, actually, I think is like another good example of where you have just
Yeah,
the sheriff, the town sheriff, he just does not give two F's, and it's I'm doing my job, get out of my way.
right, right. And that's, yeah, the result of a misspent youth of spending too much time in front of a TV watching, you know, all kinds of westerns, because that was the dominant theme, you know, years ago. And it sort of made a return with the neo westerns, but you know, westerns used to dominate American media, relentlessly with the TV shows that you just mentioned, and it can't help but seep into your
Mhm.
consciousness. You know, I'm not sure if this is, you know, a good reflection on the way I was raised, but I remember being like 6 years old, sitting in the theater watching True Grit. You know,
Ooh.
it's like, should I really be here watching this? Um, you know, by today's standard, the original is a little tame. I get that,
Hmm.
but you know, it's a
At
pretty
the
big
time,
influence on a six
yeah.
year old kid. Um, and then I couldn't wait to see the remake, which I thought was good too. But yeah, the old style, you know, gunslinger type person, I knew that he was going to be that type of person because I think that inherently brings, if you're that kind of person, that's fine.
Hmm.
Um, you know, John Mellencamp wrote a lyric a long time ago that I really love, where he said, you know, you can do it your own. I do things my way, but I pay a high price.
Yeah, that's
Okay, that's kind of the way
yeah.
Colt lives.
Hmm.
He's he's always going to do it his way, and he
Hmm.
always pays a price for that.
Hmm.
And I think that's just essential to his makeup.
Well, it reminds me of, and not to belabor the Western point, but it reminds me of that concept of from Westerns. I can't remember what book it was that it talked about, but the idea that Westerns are the American archetype. That's
Mm-hmm.
our knight on horseback is a cowboy with a hat. It's a distinctly American thing, which is, I think, part of the reason why we just latched onto it. But besides that, the idea of the man of violence,
Mm-hmm.
that the gunslinger, it's that concept from Shane, and it's done even beautifully again. Like I know that Logan is not the James Mangold film with Hugh Jackman. It's not necessarily Western, but it does pay direct homages to a lot of Western tropes. It's that
Right.
idea of the man of violence who creates order but cannot live within that order he creates.
Exactly. Outlaw
And
Jesse Wells,
exactly. So it's
or Kevin Costner's character in Open Range.
mhm.
You know, using and it's I'll hold that thought for a second, but yeah, using that violence to get to a place of at least perceived righteousness
Mhm.
or redemption. That's a fascinating thing to think about.
Another one, Man Who Shot Liberty Valance is a good example of it. Dunson is
Yeah,
the character that creates these towns, but cannot actually be what the towns need to be to grow and become real places.
right,
And
right.
Cole is an interesting dichotomy of that, where he is someone who he has to stand for law and order, being the sheriff, but yet he does have that uh, not necessarily shoot first and ask questions later, but very much the take the most direct route first. And that's where, again, I think that the way you structured the story is good because it constantly puts obstacles in his way. Because, like you said, you as the writer can just determine, oh, if he gets what he wants, this story's
Right.
over. That's the secret sauce to writing, is giving characters the capacity to get what they want. And then the motivation, this is what they want, and then seeding the story throughout with things that prevent them from reaching that point.
Yep. I was taught that, by a couple of really good instructors that, hey, look, if you have to give that character something to work through, otherwise you've got a two-page, short story, which makes writing short stories really hard. But yeah, and then constantly throwing something in front of him to frustrate him,
Hmm.
and then in that moment of frustration, he's probably going to do something that gives you, a turn or another aspect of that character. I didn't think he would do that just because he was frustrated. And that's sometimes it's fun to come up with those obstacles, and sometimes it's like, oh boy, what do I do now?
Especially when you have a highly competent character. It makes it more difficult because they can handle a lot of different things. Arguably, not to go back to the Bond well too much, but Ian Fleming basically created James Bond as like the perfect can do anything type guy. So then what does he have to use to throw obstacles his way? In case of like Live and Let Die, he's gonna be keel hauled at the back of a boat. Like things that
Right.
normally not even a thought, but we have to go to some very high stakes things. The world has
Yeah,
to end to challenge Bond.
right. And you see the very same thing in Batman. He's constantly presented with, insurmountable obstacles that he, surmounts. And I mean, that's why you pay attention to the character. It's like, how's he
Mhm.
going to get out of this one? What's he going to do now? I think that's where the real interest becomes. You're talking about the violence thing,
Mhm.
um, not not a Western thing, but in college, if you take a literature class, you're going to come across Flannery O'Connor and the whole way that she was able to and I don't remember the quote, but she said that she'd like to explore using her characters to find grace through violence. And
Yes.
that has stuck with me for years. It's like, oh, how do you do that? How does one find a moment of grace
Hmm.
through violence? And violence can come in any form. Um, the grace is a little harder, and it's like, okay, that's kind of what I'm interested in exploring. And I'm not saying I do it well, but a lot of times that's what I start with. And I think especially when you start talking about the Western tropes, and a lot of the Westerns are really morality plays.
Yes.
I think of, like, High Plains Drifter to me with Clint
Mhm.
Eastwood is really a morality play, and it uses a lot of violence. And is there any grace at the end? And you probably do a whole literature class on whether or not there is. But that's something that I think violence can be used as a vehicle to get there. Um, I don't claim to be a master at it, but it's something that I say, okay, how am I going to do this? Grace and
Mhm.
violence, how do I do it? And
Yeah.
and go from there. And I do think in Not Dead Enough, there is
Hmm.
a moment at the end of the book where, after all the violence that's gone through, and I intentionally made this a violent novel, but
Hmm.
at the end of it, there is just a glimmer of grace for Colt that he has not seen in a long time. And I thought that was pretty important for him. And I thought, okay, this is where I want him to be standing on that porch
Hmm.
at the end, with this decision in his head. And I thought that was good for him as a character.
Hmm. Well, I think it really helps with. So I recently we had a conversation with Charles Ardai, the editor of Hard Case Crime. We talked a lot
Mhm.
about the idea of how noir can is a very malleable idea, but some of the best are the ones that like literally take your heart at the end and just crush it into nothingness because you thought there was hope, there is absolutely no hope. That's like the really dark version of it. I
It
think
is.
that there is equal space for having really hard, tough, difficult things that you put your characters through. And then at the end, they make the right choice or they're faced with making a good choice. And
Yeah.
that can, especially when you're doing a serialized character, there I think is one of the key differences. When you're not doing a serialized character, you can end really dark and it really doesn't matter.
Right.
But when you have a serialized character, you need to keep them at a place where they are growing to a certain degree. I think Travis McGee actually is a really good comparison where there are lots of moments in those stories where I think, especially the first one, you just, by the end of it, your heart's kind of broken, but
Hmm.
you still end on a hopeful note. And it makes you want to read the next one because you want to continue to see this character grow as a person and have this life that we want for them.
Right, and they don't lose their humanity. You're talking about
Mhm.
serialized characters. I think you have to do that. When I wrote writing short stories,
Mhm.
the one that I wrote for Starlight,
I
for
actually wanted to
example,
bring that up at some point too. So yes.
because that one ends kind of dark.
Hmm.
There's this he's just a dirty double crosser, period. But Travis does a lot of things. I don't know that they're, and I like how you put, a right decision and a good decision. I'm not sure if Travis always makes the right decision, but he makes a good one.
Hmm.
And there is a difference. And I think, at the end of Not Dead Enough, I think Colt makes a good decision.
Hmm.
You could argue if it's the right one, but he makes a good one. Travis McGee, through, he's sort of a melancholy guy to begin with, but
Yeah.
he has a North Star.
Hmm.
And that's really important for him. It's important for the readers because, like you said, you do finish, the deep blue goodbye. When you're at the end, it's a little heavy and it's a little
Hmm.
sad, but you're so attached to Travis by this point. Yeah, you do, because he hasn't lost his humanity, and I think that's pretty important. If and the way I've always viewed Colt is, okay, if he's going to do it his way and pay a price, then the reader needs to see the price,
Yes.
because seeing him pay the price makes him human.
Yes.
Otherwise, he's the Joker. Otherwise.
Yes. Which, before I actually have a comment with the Joker, but I do want to insert this one question in between those. Do you have a favorite Travis McGee novel?
Ooh.
Or one that
Um,
stands out to you as like that's your go-to when you're in a Travis McGee mood?
I hate to default to the first one, but the first one was so solid.
Yeah.
Um, I like that one a lot. And I've probably read that one the most. There were a few that were very short that were still really punchy. The Scarlet Roots is a very short Travis McGee novel,
Mm-hmm.
but it's kind of a study. And I pulled that one down a few times just to look at the structure of it. It's a study in
Mm-hmm.
a very compact story. It's a couple of hundred pages long in the paperback version, but it feels like it's 300 or 400 pages because he's able to. MacDonald was so good at dialogue and compactness. Making that story as tight as humanly possible. So I think those are probably the two that jump out of my mind at first.
Mm-hmm. Both excellent selections. So then the comment with the Joker. So the short story in
Yeah.
Starlight Pulp Review number 3, which I am so excited to have my name alongside yours in that
Me
book
too.
because it's
Me too.
so cool. It was a killer lineup, such great stories. Rats was one of my favorites. It is
Well, thank you.
so good, and it reminds me in ways of the opening of The Dark Knight.
Ah, with the
And
bank
not to
robbery
spoil
scene.
anything, but the whole bank robbery scene where you
Yeah.
see a character uh lay out what he does.
Hmm.
It is tight, it's brilliant, a good short story from what I think it was a Neil Gaiman thing I had read, was like a good short story should, in theory, be either the climax of what's happening of another story, or it is the beginning launching off point.
Right. Okay.
Your story, I think, really fits into either mold, but especially that idea of this is like the pre-title sequence of something else about to happen, which is really cool because it leaves you on that high of, oh wow.
Thank you for that. Yeah, that you mentioned the Joker, and I got my head spinning. Um, it was one of the most stunning openings to a movie I've ever seen. When you see the Joker from behind, and he's just standing on the street corner,
Mhm.
you're like, oh, now I get it. And it becomes incredible. Uh, that story was originally a lot longer, and I, I went to the Bread Loaf Writing Conference, and as a fiction writer, and you have to take a story with you when you go. And I'll never forget this, and I'll try to keep this, as short as possible. My instructor was a guy named Tom Payne, coincidentally, Tom Payne. brilliant writer. He's a bit of a madman, but he's a brilliant writer.
Hmm.
And he told us all to put our stories on the desk. And we did. And mine was, I don't know, 25, 30 pages, as were most people in the class, because, it's a fully formed short story. And Tom said, okay, everybody take the first 7 pages of your story, just take it off the top. And we all did. And he said, throw it down on the floor. We looked at him like, okay, he is crazy. We put the pages on the floor and he said, that's where you start your short story. And we're like, what the hell are you talking about? And he said, too many times you start to write a short story and you're sort of,
Hmm.
starting the engine and you're getting the gears going. And then, it's not until page 7 or 8 that you're really in the middle of your story. And that could sort of retrain my brain to say, okay, where I think the start of the story is probably not. And then, you get to this point to where, okay, I'm in the middle of the action now. And for short stories, a lot of times, the climax or the launching off point, okay, you're going to be in the middle of the action, or you should be. And this is what Tom was saying. And I found that, yeah, that's a pretty good tool. And then you end up, like in the story, it's 4 o'clock in the morning. I'm in the back of a van going down the interstate. You're like, okay, I can start here.
And it, again, just kudos, great story. I really enjoyed it. I'll encourage people to seek it out because it also has like a nice Elmore Leonard quality, which it could be
Thanks.
because I've been reading a bunch of Elmore Leonard novels too, but that's the way that you have these criminals interacting with each other was
Right.
absolutely fantastic.
Well, look, if you're going to write crime fiction, Elmore Leonard is the Bible. I learned so much about writing dialogue from reading everything from Elmore Leonard that I could get my hands on. And John MacDonald was great at it
Hmm.
too. The conversations that Travis has. Ed McBain is good, a little bit more edgy, but I don't know, Elmore Leonard's ability to make you hear those characters talking and see them talking to each other was otherworldly. Joe Lansdale does a great job at it too. Hap and Leonard, the series that was on, I believe it was on HBO, it was the back and forth banner was just so outstanding. And I've always wanted to do that. And, Elmore Leonard's dialogue is a really good way to learn how to do that.
Hmm. So tell me, Phil, what is your writing process? It's one of my favorite questions to ask writers. You had told me, you mentioned earlier what it had been when you were sitting in front of the giant monolith computer. Do you have a writing routine now? And if so, kind of what does it look like?
Not so much a routine as a process.
Hmm.
I'm coming near the end of my you know working career, which is
Hmm.
great because I'll have more time to develop a routine. But it
Congratulations.
is, thank you. It is a process right now. I picked up the habit of writing longhand a
Mm.
long time ago, and I keep a notebook with me all the time, everywhere I go.
Hmm.
It drives my girlfriend crazy sometimes, but I keep that notebook handy, and I will write as it comes to me. I'll scribble down whether it's a scene or a piece of dialogue, or part of an outline. And when I've got enough of that bouncing around, what I typically do is sit down and write, a pretty in-depth outline, a fabula. It's really the 4 or 5 page narrative of what the entire story is going to be. It's sort of a plot device, but it's also a way to organize, the umbrella of the story for me. So I'll write that out, and then that becomes my guidepost for writing. And everything that I write after that tries to, tie back to that outline. And then, it's a matter of finding the time to sit down. I used to, the pandemic kind of put it into it, but
Hmm.
once a year I would just go away and rent a house on the
Oh.
beach
Hmm.
and just spend the entire weekend writing, you know,
Ooh. Hmm.
um, which is good. Today, on a day-to-day basis, I keep the notebook handy. When I have a moment, I'll write and write and write longhand, and then I'll spend some time transcribing it, into Scrivener. I picked up that program a few
Hmm.
years ago, started using it, and that becomes my first edit because, as I
Yeah.
write it longhand, it's just fresh out of my brain, and then
Hmm.
when I transcribe it, it's like, yeah, I'm gonna twist this around a little bit, or I'm gonna push this off to the future, and then it starts to become organized, and then it becomes, chapters, in a working copy, and eventually it becomes the final manuscript.
That's really cool. There was a book I read recently. Well, I say recently, it was last year, called Refuse to Be Finished or something like that. Refuse to Be Done, and by Matt Bell. The idea that I took away from it that I really liked was he said instead of copying and pasting like your draft one, draft two, open up like both and
Mhm.
start just transcribing it, because through doing that, you just cut out so many of those first round edits by doing it
Right.
that way. And what you're describing is exactly that type of process. And I think that it's so good because it really does, it cuts out an extra step, even though it feels like it takes longer.
It does feel like it takes longer, and people have kind of looked at me funny and said, "God, that's a very laborious process." But I have found it to be a little bit more efficient, um, because I'm sort of editing in stride, at least the
Mm-hmm.
first time. Now, granted, there's
Yeah.
after you get it done, and how do you know when you're finished? I don't know how
Yeah.
you know when you're finished, but it's always a question for me.
When I
I
start
think I know where the end
unraveling the
is.
plot, that's
Right.
when I know.
I think I know where it's supposed to end, but then I get there and I'm like, either I'm not ready to end it, or I think there needs to be more. There has to be more. And,
Mhm.
sometimes there is and sometimes there isn't.
Well, I think that I'm curious what you think on a short story basis, because I feel like for a novel, usually, at least the way I construct them, usually I already have a good idea of my endpoint. There's this scene, this is the final scene.
Right.
Whereas for a short story, I always feel like, oh, but where is that like landing point necessarily? Because it feels, even though it's like one event, sometimes it feels more fluid. Weirdly, I write tighter novels than I do short stories by
I
nature.
think a lot of people do that, actually. What did Mark Twain say? If he had more time, he'd write a short story. Um, because people think, oh, it's a short story. Just crank it out. And no, it's not quite. I think that'll, there's a lot of opportunity to err in a short story. I do believe that. I've read some of Ed McBain's very, very first short stories, and you get through them and you're like, well, what the hell did I just read? It wasn't that great. But of course it evolves. Short stories for me tend to be a snapshot in time.
Mm,
And, I try to intentionally not let my mind wander off into the what ifs of that particular snapshot in time.
hmm
Um, I wrote a story once about a guy on a subway train.
mm,
The whole event probably lasts about 7 minutes,
hmm
in real time. But it was just what happened to him in that 7 minutes on that subway train, and I didn't think beyond that. And for me, that's a mental thing to keep me focused on what exactly the short story is. Um, and for me, the trick and the challenge is to, okay, even though it's a short story, like the one in Starlight, you don't need the character's entire bio,
hmm
but you need to know a little bit about who he is and what his motivations are, and where his conflict resides. So that's trying to cram all that into a short story can be a real challenge. But I tend to just make it, okay. This is the snapshot that I'm looking at. How do I build a story around
It's
it?
like you focus the lens first,
Yeah,
and that's how you then orient the rest of the picture.
yeah, yeah. And I think um, so many times people will write a short story that ends up becoming a novel. And I didn't do that with this one, because I mean, The Booze Rumor was the name of the short story that I wrote for the Veterans Project. That was a long time ago, and they're really, really not connected. But that short story did kind of give birth to a much broader, bigger
hmm
story.
Moon Pie was
But
also a fun character.
yeah, Moonpie is great. I did enjoy. I mean, how can you not like a guy named Moonpie?
Well, and like I
Um,
think you describe him as like a machine gun god or something like that a couple of
yeah,
times.
yeah. And, I mean, you know, I knew so I knew a lot of people in the Marine Corps that probably had a lot of that personality. I acknowledged a lot of people in this book at the end,
hmm
because none of those characters are specific people that I know or
Yeah.
knew, but they are definitely the embodiment of several different people that I ran across. And, there's a machine gun god everywhere in the Marine Corps. There's the goofy little, surfer kid. It's just this huge cauldron of personalities that come out when you're working with these people. And Moonfire was one of them.
I do think that dynamic between Flip and Moonpie was also just so much fun because it really does kind of have a Laurel and Hardy type flavor where
A
there's
little bit.
someone that has this is what they're going to do, this is what they're doing, and the other dude is just along for the ride going, this is such a good idea.
I'm just
So
going to roll with it.
thank you so much. Philip, where can people go to learn more about you and your work?
I have a website, Phillip Thompson Books,
Mhm.
that has a listing of short stories and fiction that I've written, and just some little biographical information. Of course, all my books are on Amazon. They're also, you can find them at Brash Books. I think it's brash-books.com.
Mhm. And also, just as a congratulations, Not Dead Enough was an Amazon bestseller. Congratulations. That's
Thank you.
awesome.
Look, I was more surprised than anybody, but thank you. Yeah, that's I was fantastic.
So everyone should be sure to go check it out. I will link all of the stuff in the show notes, including your socials. Philip, thank you again for joining us on the show.
Thank you. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and maybe we can do it again soon sometime.
I hope so.
All right. Thanks, Terrence.